Hello, your good pal Kirby fan here with a brand new, very late, but more importantly, brand new copy ability spotlight. We've got a long overdue one today, so I hope you enjoy it. If you're watching this video before June 20th, 2022, you can leave a comment on this video voting for which ability I cover next. You can see which abilities I've already covered in the copy ability spotlight playlist. And hey, if you're watching and it's too late to leave a vote, tell me what you think about Cutter in the comments. Do you like it? Hate it? Did you even know before watching that Final Cutter is not a part of Swords moveset Smash Fans? That sounds like a call-out post, sorry about that. But also, don't forget to dash over to that like button, and to help me make non-stop videos, ring the notification bell after subscribing to be notified whenever I upload. If you're a part of the 82% of viewers who aren't subscribed, cut that bad habit out and subscribe to the channel. Now that I've made a reference to half of Cutter's moveset, let's get started. Wow, you know, this only took 19 spotlights, but the basic trio of early game abilities are going to be done. Beam, Sword, and now Cutter. Although, I mean, if we're being real here, Beam really shouldn't count. I should do that one again at some point, but regardless, Cutter is a longtime staple, debuting at the very beginning and showing up as recently as the newest game, Kirby and the Forgotten Land. When reading the comments, I notice a lot of people, when voting for Cutter, mention that it isn't good in practically any of the games that it's in. Compared to Sword and Beam, that makes sense, but I guess we can find out why so many see this as a bad ability. Was this a cutting-edge ability, or did Cutter drop the ball in terms of performance? That right there might actually be my favorite pun that I've made for any of these spotlights so far. Anyway, let's talk Cutter. For those who don't know how these spotlights work, we cover the games where an ability isn't very good first. We want to get through the bad to get to the good, all that stuff. And given that Cutter's been around since the very beginning, you don't need me to tell you that in Kirby's Adventure, it doesn't hold a candle to Tornado. Most boss-killing abilities can't compete as it is, so how Cutter is going to compare to those? Yeah, no, that's just not happening to begin with at all. I should clarify that the routing isn't very different for 100%. You have to use specific abilities for certain switches, and World 7, I guess, has randomly hype abilities like Laser and Ice, but you still want to generally stick with Tornado for most of the game. Cutter just doesn't stand a chance. While we're here, let's knock Nightmare and Dreamland out as well. Tornado was nerfed pretty hard, so maybe Cutter would have a chance? Well, to explain why it doesn't, let's get into some specifics. Let's talk numbers. Nothing complicated, haters, just some basics. When you hit an enemy, bosses included, you deal a certain amount of damage to them. In the Sword video, I detailed that, even though the ability only deals 5 damage per hit, while abilities like Ball deal 14, the speed of which Sword destroyed bosses totally made up for it. Cutter, while very safe, only deals 4 damage per hit, and it just can't compare to the speed of something like Sword. Abilities getting full movesets in Superstar may have given Cutter a better shot, but it simply wasn't meant to be. I really want to say that it can't cut, but it isn't awful, but so many better options exist. Even Bomb, which we covered last time, fared better. Neither are great, but at least Bomb strats can result in a pretty good time. The best arena time that I could find for Cutter was over 4 minutes, and that was a task. And, unlike Nightmare and Dreamland, it's much of the same story for Superstar Ultra. It's got one of the worst times for Helper to Hero, there's no fun 100% stats for Milky Way wishes with it, etc. Cutter's not very good in Kirby's Dream Land 3 either, but this one's much funnier than the rest. See, we'll get to Kirby's Dream Land 2 down the line, so I'll say this now, just to keep your interest piqued. I need to get my watch time boosted somehow, after all. Q plus Cutter in Dreamland 3 is one of the most butchered and nerfed abilities in the entire series. If you'd like to know why, stay tuned for Dreamland 2. Amazing Mirror has some great ability variety in both any percent and 100%, but you don't see Cutter very much in either. It simply isn't strong or fast enough to really contribute very much. However, unlike every other game we've talked about so far, Amazing Mirror is the first one where Cutter actually has some sort of use. Against the Mega Titan, arguably the hardest fight in the game, you usually trivialize it with Wheel. What else? But the rooms leading up to the fight are some of the easiest to lose your ability in. If you do lose Wheel, you can grab Cutter right before the fight and pretty easily beat the Mega Titan with it instead. It's much slower and won't be used unless you lose Wheel, but if you do, Cutter is a real lifesaver. Cutter is also in Kirby Star Allies. And that's about all I can say about it that's worthwhile. It has no real use in any percent, 100%, ultimate choice, even guest star allies. Even with elements, there's just nothing to really comment on. It could be stronger, faster, etc. It's kind of a shame since, if you couldn't tell, Cutter was rather good in the rest of the modern games, but for it to fall flat in Star Allies is really kind of a shame. And to add to that, even though it was one of the lucky few to make it into Forgotten Land, it's one of the very small handful of abilities that have zero uses for most categories. For any percent and the Coliseum modes, there's nothing, and while you think you need it for a few Waddle Dees in an all Waddle Dee or Hundo playthrough, there's nothing that you need it for aside from Treasure Roads in Hundo. It is a shame that Cutter's most recent appearance isn't very good, but this video is about to take a total 180 here, folks. Looking at Cutter through the games it hasn't been very good in, what have its main issues been? It's fun to use and plenty cute, but it isn't fast or strong. The Cutter blade itself has its uses, but if it's too slow to deal quick damage while also lacking good movement, there's no real perk it has over other, better abilities. So what's different in the games that it's actually good in? The short answer is, the point of the video is to find out why. The long answer though, here we go. Kirby's Dream Land 2 is totally dominated by Q. Hype rhyming there aside, the reason for this is as simple as can be. Q moves really, really fast. Kind is good underwater, sure, but he's very rarely needed, considering water is not only rare, but getting Kind for those bits and losing out on Q later on mostly isn't worth it. As for Rick, we still don't talk about that. It's for his own good. In this house, we love Rick. But with all that being the case, abilities serve two functions in Kirby's Dream Land 2 speedrunning. First, how do they work with Q? And second, how are they when you don't have Q? And how quickly can they get you back to having Q? Cutter plus Kirby is not good on its own. It has all of the standard issues that it's had in previous games. Cutter plus Rick is also not good, but we don't talk about that, we love Rick in this house. Kind plus Cutter is actually not that bad, but if you want a projectile with Kind, you're better off with Kind plus Fire. Because of course you are. With all of that said, and there's actually literally no hyperbole here, Cutter plus Q is the best ability in the entire game. Whoa. Yeah. The thing about Dreamland 2 is that, because Q's mobility is so good, you really don't need to worry about abilities that help you go faster. They're there, sure, but Q is just so zoom fast that they wind up being unnecessary. What is necessary, though, are boss fights, and if you don't have a way to beat them quickly, you're in trouble. Oh, and mini-bosses, of course, that counts too. With Cutter, Q throws 3 feathers at enemies, 1 forward and 2 diagonally. If you get up close and personal with the bosses, this deals absurd damage. It's not even like there's a lot of cooldown, so you can just do it again, and again, and again, over and over and over. The cycle just never ends. Needless to say, a better damage dealing option against bosses simply doesn't exist with Q, and since damage is Q's only major weakness, Cutter patches that up quite nicely. You even use it a lot in regular levels, since it deals with enemies so well. The fact that there's 3 feathers is a real asset when you're trying not to get hit, and I mean, if you get hit, you lose time. Why would you want to get hit? I don't know why I felt the need to explain that one. I didn't even have that written in the script, but I don't know, you're welcome. I will admit, it's a lot trickier to manage for best ending and Hundo, considering you need a lot more back and forth with abilities and animal buddies, but it's still very strong. It's not the absolute monster is in any percent. I mean, it is, but you know what I mean. So why is it bad in Dreamland 3 then? Oh yeah, it's much slower, and you only throw 1 feather instead of 3. It's kind of a shame since ability variety in Dreamland 3 is much more vast. I feel like you'd have a healthy mix of Clean, Fire, and Cutter if it was still good. And that's just for Q. Maybe if Cutter with any of the other animal friends was good, you could also see it in Best Ending or Hundo or something. Oh well, point is, it got nerfed so badly in Dreamland 3 because it was so dominantly good in Dreamland 2. Much like how Dreamland 2 is dominated by Q, Kirby 64 is dominated by Fire. Most of the any % run is either Fire or Fire plus Fire, and most of the variation in Hundo is simply for hunting Crystal Shards. So where does Cutter fit into this? Unfortunately, the fan favorite Cutter plus Bomb Shuriken attack is not very good. It's just too slow and overall weak, although it gets some bonus points for looking so darned cool. Cutter plus Cutter, for as funny as this is, also isn't very good. If you thought Cutter plus Bomb was slow, Needle plus Cutter doesn't offer much except for some nightmare fuel, and while Cutter plus Ice is a personal favorite of mine, sadly, it's not very good. I guess out of the ones we've talked about so far, it is the best, since it offers some movement utility. Kirby goes faster when you continuously press forward. It's still not great. Don't get me wrong with all of this, I'm not trying to say that Cutter is a superstar of an ability in this game, but there are still some ability combinations with it that are actually legitimately good. For example, while not insane, Spark plus Cutter has Kirby take out this lightsaber looking thing and do some spinny spins with it. Unlike the Shuriken, it not only looks cool, but has some nice utility to it. Because this move lasts forever, plus it has a hitbox at all times as long as it's out, this means that it's really good for clearing out hordes of enemies. Kirby 64 doesn't have a lot of enemy hordes, and it faces steep competition in this role from Fire plus Bomb, but it's good enough to be used in 100% for more than just getting Crystal Shards. In particular, this bit right here, where the runner, Curtissimo, has to ditch it to get Fire plus Needle to get a shard, then immediately gets rid of it to get the lightsaber back, is a telling of how good it is for clearing out these hordes. Well, it's mostly really funny and cool, but it also has that going for it. Fire plus Cutter is another fan favorite. The Fire Sword is very, very strong, but because it lacks any kind of utility for movement and mini-bosses are so weak, it doesn't really matter much. Still, boss fights are a thing that exists, and that's where the Fire Sword excels. For speedrunning, it actually doesn't get to show its stuff very much, since having abilities for levels is far more important, but you do get to see it against Magman, the boss of World 4. It's too bad you can't take abilities into the boss endurance mode, like in Superstar. I'd be very interested to see how good this ability would be. Lastly, and I'm sure all Kirby 64 Hundo runners are pulling their hair out just thinking about this, let's talk about Cutter plus Stone. Basically, Kirby transforms into a random animal friend, and you get a specific perk from each. If you get Pitch from this, you actually get a pretty good speed boost, which is kinda nice. The rest of the buddies don't do much, especially Kine, who literally does nothing. But we need to talk about one specific Crystal Shard. You need to get Rick from the pool of animal friends and wall jump to the shard. Easy enough, but remember, which animal friend you get is totally random. Unless you manipulate RNG from the very beginning of the game, you can be on a world record pace and lose it just because of one shard. To put this into perspective, not even 2 weeks ago, oh my god, okay, not even 2 weeks ago when I wrote this script, this video is so late, I'm so sorry. The 4th Kirby speedrunning relay was held, and the commentators were constantly making jokes about how rough this shard was. We had some good attempts, we even got a 2nd try, which is really good, and some iffy ones like a 7th try, but if you're not watching the background footage, which you really should be, this one took 18 tries. So is Stone plus Gutter good? Pitch is good, and technically you do have to use it for 100%, but it's also like the worst ability in the entire game. Cutter overall though, it's pretty good, not bad. Jumping ahead now, Cutter in Squeak Squad is actually really bad. Look, I know we're talking about it being good, just hear me out. In any %, you know what I have to say. Is it wheel? No? Lamau. Even if more abilities were to get used, Cutter still has the same problems it always has. However, Cutter has one saving grace, and it's a rather nifty one. Ability scrolls. With the scroll, Cutter kind of becomes a reasonably good boss killer. And it's all well and good, but why go out of your way to get an ability scroll if you could just use wheel? For any %, there's no reason, but for any category that involves you getting ability scrolls, in particular 100%, it's very nice. So, okay, I haven't been able to talk about Squindo or Squendo ever in these spotlights, so let's break down all of the things Cutter has to overcome in order to be usable. First, why use it when it makes you lose wheel? Now, this one is easy. Because of the ability bubbles you can store on the bottom screen, it's easy to find a wheel bubble somewhere and store it later. And maybe you have to mix for it, which is hard, but you're speedrunning, you take any time save that you can possibly get. Next, why use Cutter when you can use other boss killing abilities, especially when invincibility candy is so easy to get? Pre-scroll, the answer is, once again, there's no reason, but Cutter's benefits from getting that scroll breathe it some life. It still struggles to keep up, but it can, and that's what matters. Take 4-1 for example. In most cases, I'd say this isn't worth it very much since you take Cutter for a chest and a mini-boss and move on. It looks cool, but you're just using it because you have to, not because of any speed perk. But you keep it for the boss fight, and you could totally route this in a way that you have an ability to use that is not Cutter, like Wheel. It's a coincidence, sure, but the fact that Cutter is good for this fight definitely, to me, at least says something. From here on, it doesn't see use in the run, in which case I'd label it under not good and just move on, except it does see one more battle, and that is the final boss. Again, I can't give Cutter too much credit here since most of the work is done by mixing a candy beforehand, but if you just rely on the candy, then you will lose time. Cutter is great here because it deals good damage and can hit... what is this boss's name again? Hold on. Wick, Kirby, Squeak Squad, bosses... Dark Nebula, that's the name, okay. Anyways, Cutter has an easy time hitting Dark Nebula while still dealing enough damage to where you can quickly and reliably take it out. So is Cutter actually good in Squeak Squad? In most games, I'd still probably say no, but Squeak Squad has one of the largest gaps between good and bad abilities. Very few abilities in this game aren't either insane or useless, so actually giving a verdict on Cutter is really hard. Useless at any percent, but what isn't other than Wheel, but has its specific uses for 100% that can extend to a category like boss endurance. Not great, but also passably good. At the end of the day, because of the game in question, I am going to label Cutter as good, but just barely. Regardless, good is good. This is an amazing mirror where it's a backup strat at best. The perks that it has here are so good that you would actually rather use it over an ability like Wheel. That has to mean something, even if what that thing is like so incredibly small you need binoculars to see it. So far, we've seen Cutter be broken, pretty good, and barely good. There's very little stability here, which is surprising, but things are still unstable because in Return to Dreamland, Cutter is none of those things that I just said. Its usage varies greatly depending on what category you look at, but to get the obvious one out of the way, any percent. Is it Wing? I did this joke already with Squeak Squad, you get it, we're gonna move on. I suppose if you want to make me happy and run my ability draft to any percent, Cutter seems to be the best option for all of Cookie Country, but I think a total of 2 people, including myself, have run that, so it doesn't really count. For 100%, Cutter can't cheat and have cool tech to show off during a challenge stage like, say, Bomb can, so it has to actually earn its place in the category. Sad to say, 100% is dominated by multiplayer strats, which killed off a lot of ability variety in the category. Cutter was not one of the abilities to survive, although you may still see it occasionally. It depends on a variety of factors unrelated to Cutter, and if you're watching a video about Cutter, that's what you care about, right? Right. Of course, you can split Hundo into 2 different categories, 1 player and 2 player plus, and for 1 player, Cutter actually does get a chance to shine. Mostly in the early and mid-game, it doesn't have enough aerial momentum to do much starting in any noon, but it having one of the most abusable dash attacks helps it get you through levels where you don't have many alternatives. To explain why the dash attack is so good, or well, briefly explain, there's next to no end lag on it, so you can use it, and almost right away you can use it again. If you like Cutter and want to use it, get used to hearing this sound a whole lot. Now, once actual alternatives present themselves, bye-bye Cutter, but either way, it's still good to have. With all of this information in our brain, and most importantly, our hearts, I'm sure at least a few of you noticed that I mentioned that Cutter has its uses against bosses. This translates very well to the arena modes, where Cutter, while not a meta-defining threat or whatever, does super duper well. In fact, there's no low point to Cutter's performance. There are some where it's only good, like HRD 3, and there are some where it is a meta-defining threat, like Landia, but for the most part, it's remarkably consistent in being really, genuinely great. So what the heck happened here? Thus far, I haven't gone too much into detail on Cutter's moveset, and if it's been good, its moveset is remarkably simple. And if it's bad, well, we want to be happy for Cutter, not bully, so I've just glossed over it. But now I need to go into specifics, mostly on one move, Cutter Drop. If you're in the air and you attack while holding down, Kirby, you drop. Cutter Drop. Kirby does the... Kirby does Cutter. On its own, this move is fine. It helps you get to the ground safe while dealing good damage, but when Kirby lands, you can immediately act out of it. And I don't mean it has low cooldown like Cutter Dash. I mean literally you can do anything right away. You need to be wary of the brief period where, after getting hit, bosses can't take damage, but that window is so short and you have so much time to set up another attack, it doesn't really matter. That's the core of what makes it so good, but you see plenty of other moves in Cutter's kit too. Sweep Cutter, holding the attack button in mid-air, can be used shortly before a Cutter drop to add on some extra damage. Hyper Boomerang, the charge attack, can be great to add on some extra damage and hit multiple bosses. Final Cutter, attacking close to an enemy, has its perks in certain fights. And Cutter Dash, the dash attack, I think we went over this one already, doesn't get used for fights very often, but it's really good as a dash attack. You can use it to get to where you need to go faster. And that right there is most of Cutter's moveset, and even though most of it doesn't wind up getting used much compared to Cutter Drop, it's still pretty nifty. Return to Dreamland Cutter is another one of the tricky ones to properly rate. It's definitely good, its arena times are enough evidence of that, but it being pretty useless for the main game, aside from one-player hundo, really hurts it. Not sad, because it is genuinely useful in that one category, plus the arena modes, I think we can settle on Cutter overall being great. It's a unique kind of great for sure, but settle for what you can get. Trust me, things can be a lot worse. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Triple Deluxe because not too much has changed. It's about equally as good for the arena modes as it was in Return to Dreamland, which much of the same abuse Cutter drop strategies, but you can't argue with a move as good as that one. For any percent, it's still pretty useless, but with multiplayer not being a thing in this game, surely it would be better for 100%, or at least all Sunstones, right? It has its uses, but compared to the likes of Wing, and especially Fire, it's not really worth using. Because it's better at boss killing than Bomb, you do get to use it for a mini-boss at least, but that's all it really has going for it. There are differences between the two versions of Cutter, but to keep the pace of the video going, we'll move on from Triple Deluxe. And by move on, I mean we pretty much keep talking about it because it's time for Kirby Fighters Deluxe. Kirby Fighters Deluxe didn't have a very big multiplayer presence, what with it not having online and all, but according to the community tier list, for Fighters Deluxe, I like to use this, it helps us see this game as a time capsule compared to Fighters 2, Cutter was solidly seen as number 4. A big perk that it had was that, while not a hard counter, people saw it as a good option to beat Parasol, which was seen as the #1 ability in that game. For speedrunning, Cutter actually has some pretty terrific times. For the lower difficulties, it's as easy as standing in front of a CPU and just mauling it, throwing some charged hyper boomerangs in there too. That said, the thing about Kirby Fighters is that, even on higher difficulties, you don't really want to change up your strategy much. You're going to have to at certain points, but the fastest wins against a target that stands still is inevitably going to be the fastest against a harder opponent, at least when talking about Kirby Fighters AI. I mostly bring this up since Cutter has good times on all difficulties. Most abilities tend to fluctuate, but Cutter is good all across the board. And considering people thought it was great for multiplayer too, I'd say Kirby Fighters Deluxe was a pretty heckin' good game for Cutter. And now, the big one. Cutter may be the ability that's varied in quality the most between games. Awful, bad, okay, good, great, outclassed, outclassing. It's done them all, but the one we're missing is that one game where it's truly exceptional. We kind of had Dreamland 2, but it feels a little weird when that's mostly the only ability that you really see. No joke, this is the one. We're going to go a bit out of order though and talk about the arena modes before we talk about any percent or hundo. For a quick bit of recap, in the other modern games, Cutter was very good, but not, as I like to call it, a boss-killing superstar. Planet Robobot though, can someone say one of the best in the whole game? As in, unironically, top 5? Also, as in, better than some fantastic options like Ninja, Archer, and UFO? Whoa. Yeah. As always, Spotlight veterans, get your bingo cards ready to understand why Cutter is so good. Well, I mean, okay, you can look at the footage, but we need to talk about how bosses take damage in Planet Robobot. In the old school Kirby games, bosses took damage and then had a set period of invincibility where you couldn't damage them. Once Return to Dreamland rolled around, bosses still had this, but it was severely reduced and unified. Wispy and Dedede don't have any more than, say, Mr. Duder. You know why I gotta say Mr. Duder, I love his name. Triple Deluxe changed some small things, but as far as how bosses specifically take damage, not much has changed. Then, come Planet Robobot, this feature was removed entirely. Now, if you hit a boss, there's no having to wait before you hit them again. Now, unless an ability is specifically a multi-hit move, you can't just use it once and deplete boss HP. You need to use an attack repeatedly in order to see any substantial results from this. Some abilities benefited, some didn't, but what it specifically did was potentially give the biggest buff to an ability we've ever seen. Of course, I mean Cutter. So, like, how? It's just Cutter, right? Well, remember back in Return to Dreamland where I talked about how you could use Sweep Cutter, hold the attack button in the air? Well, you can still do that here just fine, but what's important is what you can do after. Immediately, you can use Cutter Drop. What this effectively means is that there's nothing stopping you from using two moves over and over that have no end lag on them with double damage compared to what it could do in earlier games. I don't know if I'm properly selling just how strong Cutter is, but there are a couple of bosses that Cutter demolishes faster than any other. And while it isn't the singular fastest for every single boss, for most of them it keeps a competitive time and is still one of the best. The lone exception is the secret final boss of the True Arena, which is still very respectable, but nothing comparatively special. But, I mean, come on, one battle compared to the 10 fights where it's one of your best options, and 2 fights where it quite literally is your best option, even compared to an ability like Hammer or Ice. You know, Ice, the best ability in the whole game for boss rush, that everybody knows how good it is. Yeah. The crazy part is, for everything that's changed, it's not like Cutter lost any other moves coming into the game. Hyper Boomerang, Cutter Dash, Final Cutter, they're all here and accounted for. They're not quite as good for killing bosses, but it's not like they're suddenly useless out of nowhere. And despite all of this, I've heard talk that, even just talking in terms of what a human can do, you know, not tool-assisted, this is a time that could be potentially lowered even further. The one downside of Cutter is that doing the boss kills properly can be really rough on your hands, but after some very intense stretches, you can see that even people can pull off some insane task-looking stuff. I don't know if this would push Cutter over the edge or anything, but people aren't satisfied with Cutter just being amazing and one of the best, which I think is really cool. Oh, the craziest part about all of this, by the way, crazier than anything else I've talked about so far, all of that carries over to the main game just fine. Believe it or not, this wasn't always the case though. For a sizable portion of Planet Robobot's life, runners just saw it as Triple Deluxe 2, which is funny because that's what it was originally going to be, but in this case, it translates to Fire being stupid good in this game just like it was in that one. Why change what isn't broken? Well, I mean, okay, it is broken, but it's pretty crazy to think about when you think about Jet, but once people discovered how good other abilities were, Cutter got it even better than it already had. Yes, Cutter actually sees use in both any percent and 100%, even all code cubes, because of how strong it is. Helping matters is that Cutter Dash still has a very little end lag on it, so you're free to use it repeatedly. Sure, in terms of moving, you'd rather have your jets and your fires, but are you really losing that much time by taking Cutter, using Cutter Dash, and zooming really fast, killing bosses like 4,000 trillion times faster, and then just getting one of those abilities later anyway? I can think of a lot of movement and boss killer abilities that simply don't see use in these categories. Even something like Hammer, which is strictly better at killing bosses than Cutter, you still see Cutter more often because it's got an amazing dash attack and it can kill bosses faster than almost any other ability. So I guess the only real question to ask before we wrap things up is, would Cutter wind up being the best ability in the whole game? That is actually a really hard question to answer. It's the only ability I can truly call terrific in the main game and the arena modes, but I would never even think to call it the best in either. For any percent, you really can't argue with Fire, and you can't compete with the speedy verticality of Jet. And sure, you see Cutter in both runs, but not nearly enough for it to be a defining ability. It fares much better in the arena modes, but facts are facts. It's top 5, but Ice, Hammer, Smash, and Doctor all outclass it. Now, most of those abilities aren't even used in any percent, and Cutter makes an absolute joke out of Fire and Jet in the arena modes, but because of all of this, I don't think I can call it the singular best. One of the best? Absolutely. It's kind of sad that Cutter never reached this height again, at least so far, but given that this is one of the most celebrated Kirby games of all time, I think that's okay. Whew, that was a mouthful. So how do we follow that up? Well, we don't actually follow it up by wrapping up like I said before, but Spotlight veterans may be surprised to hear that I'm talking about Kirby Battle Royale, and for the speedrun, no, it's not worthwhile, like, at all. Like most other abilities, you'll get the same results using Sword, which is technically faster since you don't need to switch. That being said, we have a new addition to these spotlights, and that is Kirby Battle Royale multiplayer. I was recently made aware of a Kirby Battle Royale Discord server, and after talking over Cutter with a few players in said server, I not only found out how good Bomb was, if you watch the Bomb Spotlight, that's a bit outdated already, but also that Cutter is pretty darn good. In particular, it's a good ability for Robo-Bonkers, because once Robo-Bonkers is actually knocked down, you can rapidly attack the big monkey with Cutter Boomerang and Hyper Cutter from a safe zone, free from the scary electricity on the ground that most other abilities would have to deal with. Now, of course, you can attack Cutter during all of this, but that leaves plenty of opportunity for other players to rack up points, and if Cutter is playing well enough, they can dodge attacks while still focusing on getting their own points. It's easy to assume that Hammer would be the go-to for this fight, since Hammer just kills bosses so well in most other games, but multiplayer is very different, and it's cool to see abilities that aren't Hammer have a time to shine. I don't have too much information on the other modes, but I managed to sneak a peek at a few tier lists for the game. There's no definitive tier list, but the two readily accessible ones, one for the battle arena and one for the overall game, both have Cutter as good. It isn't an ability I see many people talking about, but a fun gimmick it has is that if you're a team of 2 Cutters, each Kirby can use Final Cutter repeatedly and keep the opponent in an infinite loop until they die. Is it practical? I don't know, apparently we've only ever seen CPUs do it, but I don't know, it sounds funny to me. Lastly, moving on from Battle Royale, let's talk about Kirby Fighters 2. Unfortunately, things don't look quite as good as they did in Fighters Deluxe. For the single-handed mode, things are fine. It's not quite as good as it was before, but it holds up well enough. For the story mode, you don't ever see it as better options exist even before you unlock it. Simple enough, but what about the multiplayer? The tier list is over a year old at this point, but seeing as how Kirby Fighters 2 hasn't had much in terms of development, I'd say the top player list is still a good thing to base quality off of. And Cutter is fine. Similar to Fighters Deluxe, it has very good keep away, and Cutter Dash functions as a good get-out-of-jail-free card. Overall, though, it struggles too much with pressure once an actual ability gets in. Plus, similar to an ability like Parasol, its move list is very small. If it had some more moves to patch up its weaknesses, maybe it'd be better, but as it is, I would still say that it is good. Kind of a downer to end it on after the last few games, but seeing how it is in Forgotten Land, again, things could be worse. And that is finally a wrap. This was another really long one. I am not surprised that Cutter turned out like this, though. To answer the question that I've been dreading to have to answer, though, was Cutter actually good? Similar to what I said for Planet Robobot earlier, that's hard to answer. If we weigh the numbers, in this video I said Cutter wasn't good in 8 games and good in 9 of them. But in some of the games that it was bad in, it had a niche. In some of the good ones, it wasn't actually very good. The only game that I have real confidence in is Planet Robobot, where it is absolutely one of the best abilities in the whole game, amazing in every regard. I think I can definitely say that Cutter was pretty darn great, but that's with a pretty darn big asterisk there. It's certainly leagues and miles better than what most people think, at least from what I've observed, but kinda great is the final answer that I think we can settle on. Speaking of settling on something, don't forget to settle on which ability we're going to see in the next episode by voting in the comments. Like and subscribe too, get that notification bell rung, remember the deadline is June 20th. I am just rambling on this point. I am sorry it took so long to get another video out, but I am back in business. Bye!